Hello, welcome to the first ever episode of Eye on Academia, a monthly podcast presented by the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal. The Martin Center is dedicated to the reporting and analysis of higher education events, policies, and trends. I'm Jay Schalin, the host for today, and I was formerly the Martin Center's Director of Policy Analysis. Higher education is the primary influence on the intellectual life of the nation. If you don't like the direction the nation is moving in any aspect, political, cultural, educational, and so on, chances are you have academia to thank for that, at least in part. Therefore, how colleges and universities conduct themselves needs eyes on it so that it does not operate in secrecy. We hope this program serves just that purpose. Higher education always seems like it is heading towards some big dramatic upheaval. Roughly 15 years ago, one anticipated transformation was that a so-called higher education bubble would soon burst. That is, higher education enrollment had outgrown its natural limits and would soon implode, and academia would have to substantially downsize. Another belief popular at that time was that online education would increase exponentially and supersede the traditional college classroom. More than a few observers predicted that these developments would happen in just a few years, and both predictions turned out to be just as good as the incessant predictions by environmentalists that the world is going to end in a few years. On the other hand, both forecasts did contain some truth. We have in recent years seen an end to higher education's rapid growth that began just after World War II. And online education is now an established part of the higher education experience, although it is still secondary to the traditional classroom. Today's discussion will focus on some trends our participants think may significantly transform academia in the next few years. It should not be surprising that they see some of the same patterns that observers saw back in the 2000s, only 15 years more advanced. I'll let them explain the rest. And for our participants, first we have Jenna Robinson. She's been with the Martin Center for 16 years, and I guess for the last 7 or 8, she's been the president. We have Graham Hillard, who previously was an instructor of English at Trevecca Nazarene University and is now the Martin Center's managing editor. And then we have Shannon Watkins, who started here 6 years ago as our state reporter. She spent some time as an interim managing editor, and now she's a full-time writer and researcher. And to kick it off, let's go, what do you got, Jenna?
So I think the most important challenge facing colleges and universities is demographic decline. I think you all know that the number of high school graduates is shrinking, and the percentage of graduates who are going on to college is also declining at the same time. Predictions are that the high school graduation number is going to peak within the next 5 years at about 3.9 million high school students graduating a year, but then decline to just 3.5 million per year by 2037. That's a really sharp decline. On top of that, the percentage of high school graduates that go on to college has already peaked, and that was back in 2009, when about 70% of high school graduates went to post-secondary education, so college or university. In 2021, it was about 62%. And so the question for colleges and universities is, what are they going to do going forward? And what do we think that they should do? I think some of them should probably close. College closures have already started to rise. And with 500,000 fewer students graduating high school per year by 2037, I think it's inevitable that some colleges won't survive. Some colleges, of course, won't have to worry about it at all. Harvard is still going to have plenty of applicants probably to fill its seats, regardless of this demographic decline. But this could be an opportunity for the colleges that do have declining enrollments to refocus on their core mission of teaching. So my hope, what they should do is that colleges and universities start making smart decisions about where to make cuts so that they can refocus. So cut the administrative fat, cut unproductive programs, consolidate functions where they can. I think, a lot of colleges won't want to make those decisions. But some who are forced by declining enrollments will take those actions. And I think that'll be a positive thing at those schools. As far as I can tell, most colleges so far have not gotten to that point, especially big public institutions. So far, they're trying other things. They're trying either to lure new pools of non-traditional students to college, and they're competing for the shrinking pool of traditional students. So one example of a tactic that the UNC system is using to try to attract a kind of new pool of student is they have an initiative on partway home students. And so what they do is they reach out to students who dropped out without graduating, but who are still in good academic standing. And so they invite those students to re-enroll. And so that's a way to boost enrollment, to backfill some of those empty seats. And to compete over the existing pool of students, there are a lot of tactics that schools can use. They can compete on price, which would obviously be a really good thing for students. They already do that to some extent by tuition discounting. It would be much better if we just saw tuitions, either continuing to be frozen like they're doing at Purdue and UNC, or tuitions being cut. That would be a really positive outcome of the demographic decline. They can also compete on other things. They can compete on the programs they offer. They can compete by being more flexible, by offering different models. And so this could be a real opportunity for colleges to change, but I'm not especially optimistic about where they're going to go, given what I've seen so far.
Anybody want to jump in?
Sure, Jay, I'll jump in. One thing that we might add to the list of how colleges may compete is on amenities. I hope they don't compete on amenities, but as we've seen in the past, deans love to build new student centers. It's funny, your introduction, you talked about some of the more doom and gloom predictions about colleges that haven't come true. And yet it's hard to look at these numbers and feel optimistic about college's future. Listening to Jenna, I'm reminded of the movie Independence Day, in which President Bill Pullman is negotiating with the aliens, and he finally, in a moment of frustration, says, "What do you want us to do?" And the aliens say, "We want you to die." I think it would be terrific if colleges, started to focus more on return on investment and job training, but a good many of them just need to die.
Yeah, and we really are already seeing that. We've written about it at the Martin Center. There has been an escalation in the number of college program closures recently, but I think, ironically, I'm probably not using that word in the dramatic sense. The programs that have closed have been those that are vocational, that are focusing on career paths rather than schools closing that are kind of the traditional full college package. So hopefully we can see the right or the wrong kind of colleges close and the right kind of colleges stay open.
Well, we know that public universities like UNC Chapel Hill have a massive bureaucracy of politicized sorts of initiatives. What do you think these declining enrollment numbers will do for, those sorts of initiatives? Are they going to have to scale back or plow forward?
I think it's going to depend on the type of university, right? You mentioned Chapel Hill, but Chapel Hill has a huge number of students on their wait list, students who are applying and not getting in. So UNC Chapel Hill can just, admit students like very slightly down the academic totem pole that they wouldn't have admitted, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. They don't have that problem. But students or schools where the enrollment is already declining, I think they will have to cut, really across the board. And I think that those DEI units, those politicized administrative units should be some of the first on the chopping block, because we all know universities got along fine without them just 20 years ago. So I think if we just went back to the levels of administrators we had, say, in 2000, schools could save a lot of money and not affect their operations at all.
No, I agree. I wonder why it is that the small schools that are focused on vocation, why they are the ones that are going.
Well, I think some of them were going because, I mean, you know, it was like DeVry, right? That was one of the ones that had to close a lot of campuses, and it because they were focused on career, but they weren't giving students the ROI that they were after. And as we all know, online education has had problems. It's had problems with, you know, massive attrition, with, you know, students not attending. And so I think that it goes hand in hand right now, at least where we are with higher ed, that a lot of career focused education is also online education. So I think it's online education that has had problems, not necessarily the career focused, ROI focused education. And so maybe, you know, hopefully they'll work the kinks out in online ed. I know that's something that everybody's hoping for, right? Colleges want it, students want it. It's just, we're just not there yet.
Okay, well, let's move over to Graham here. We're kind of stepping into his topic a little, so it'd be a good time for him to tell us what he's been up to.
Yeah, so one of the most fascinating stories that I saw about higher ed last year, this was an August report from the organization Jobs for the Future. And what they found was that both employers and high school students want more non-degree career pathways, but neither group is quite ready to trust that the other group really means it. And so you have some startling numbers, and I'll just read from my list here. 58% of Gen Z students say that companies should hire more high school graduates who have pursued non-degree pathways, apprenticeships, technical training. 81% of employers agree that organizations should hire based on skills rather than degrees. Yet, 52% of employers said that despite their preferences, they still hire from degree programs because they believe it's a less risky option. And 37% of high school students said that they believe that employers favor degrees. So this, to me, it's like a marriage counseling situation where both sides think the other is not ready to change. And eventually there's going to be a breakthrough. I think personally that it's going to happen on two levels. First of all, individually, as hiring managers begin to see that the output of non-degree employees matches, and in some cases exceeds the output of employees with traditional degrees. And then on a broader cultural level, as the media continues to report on this story, I think the desire's there. It's just a matter of overcoming cultural inertia and eventually doing what's best for both employers and job seekers.
Yeah. I mean, I think a part of the story is that the college degree is still a signal. It's a weakening signal, but it still signals, and this is, you know, Brian Kaplan's thesis, that it signals that students are intelligent, diligent, and cooperative.
Right.
And so that signal is a strong signal that employers still want. And they say, you know, you just said it, they're risk averse. And so if you want an employee that's going to show up and is going to be reasonably intelligent and cooperative and kind of stick to it, you know, a college graduate's a pretty good bet, because that's what they did for 4 years, right? They showed up, they did the work, they got the piece of paper. That all that said, employers are also saying that the college graduates we are hiring don't have the skills we want them to have. And so I think that, you know, Gen Z and employers who are saying we want these non-degree options, or, you know, they're right on. If they want those skills, they should go to programs that are saying that they're going to provide the skills. Obviously, colleges are saying that they're going to do that as well. But I think that we have to break through that barrier, that the college degree as a signal. I think maybe some non-degree options have to improve their signaling function, right? I think right now we don't know very well which non-degree programs are great and which ones are not. And so I think once they're a little bit more tested, we will have that signal and they'll be able to compete better. And hopefully that'll kind of break through this inertia and we'll get there.
No, I mean, I definitely think that the signal of a college degree is weakening. And I do wonder what other pathways potential employees can take to really stand out, because I know we mentioned apprenticeships, work experience, but where do you initially even get that work experience if it's not, an apprenticeship or some sort of other career oriented activity that you're involved in. But I read in an article that a lot of employers are taking the training upon themselves. Like, okay, we know what sort of worker we want. Like, let us do the training. Now, where they get that initial pool, that's still like not clear to me.
In so many ways, that's just rewinding the clock back to before everyone went to college, when employers did do the bulk of the training. Right. If you go back before we had the GI Bill, before we had the movement for everybody to go to college, employers picked people, not based on the skills they already have, but their potential to learn what would work for the company, and then went from there. And so, and apprenticeships too, that's rewinding the clock. I think a lot of things we got a lot of things right before there was this massive push that everybody, no matter what, had to go to college.
And of course, there's the Griggs versus Duke Power Company ruling, which is preventing employers from using some of the more creative hiring tests that they might otherwise use, and instead relying on college degrees. Let's say if we had one Supreme Court precedent that we need to overturn to get some movement on this issue, that's the one.
Yeah, I mean, there is some pushback on Griggs though, right? Companies where the skill is really, really tied to the test, they still do testing. So software companies, software development, coding, anything like that, companies are allowed to administer tests, and they do administer tests, which is one of the main reasons why Google is able to hire people without college degrees, because they can administer a test that's really predictive of how well an employee is going to do. That's a lot harder in other fields, obviously, but I think it's good to see that there is pushback in those areas. And
definitely,
maybe some of those students went to coding academies, maybe they did get those non-degree options, and that's why they're able to then go to Google with the things that they've learned and get a job.
Does anybody know how coding academies were big about 10 years ago? Does anybody know how they've done? I've kind of heard that a lot of them have collapsed because they weren't getting their graduates weren't getting the offers, but I'm unsure. I mean, they were going to be the big alternative. I don't know whether they've hit that point yet, or whether that's another one of those promising things that fizzled in the long run.
I mean, I know some that have been really successful. I think the Lambda School has a great model. They're doing good things, but also Google has taken it in-house so that they're able to teach them. They're able to do the coding academy themselves. And I mean, like we said, it's employers doing the training themselves, but they've got it kind of a freestanding unit where they do a coding academy essentially, and then hire people. So I think it's a mixed bag. I mean, it's a market, right? The coding academies are actually a free market. And so we're seeing a lot of flux, a lot of entrance into the market, and some survive and do great. And I think, as you said, some have totally gone by the wayside because they weren't able to deliver.
I think part of it was just a business model problem. I mean, the New York Times reported back in 2017 that the reason a lot of these academies were closing is because they were expanding into new cities so quickly. They weren't pausing to develop relationships with local firms. And so then there's nowhere, in the neighborhood for their graduates to go.
Right.
I think colleges have also wised up. I'm constantly getting emails from UNC saying, come take our, I don't remember how many weeks it is, but like 6-month course in data science. And, it's a non-degree option coming from a traditional university.
Yeah, they offer a boot camp through the Friday Center, a coding.
There you go.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and
so, obviously, I think if colleges are co-opting that model, I think it shows that it's something that works, except that, colleges had all of this ready-made infrastructure.
Definitely.
To make them be able to compete better than some of these new startups.
Shannon, I think you should enroll in the boot camp and write about it for the Martin Center.
Well, I actually did write about these boot camps. I think in 2017. There was a lot of enthusiasm for where they were going to go, and as we have already mentioned, a lot of them bit the dust, but a few did survive, and I believe I even have a personal friend who's gone through the boot camp and now has a credential and is able to work in data science. So there are success stories from them.
Okay, and one last thing I wanted to touch on before we left this general topic area. The reason that I think the main reason that the bubble never collapsed back 15 years ago is because government money was holding it up. With all of this, like, do you see and government is certainly involved in higher education. Do you see this, that they might choose to prevent, the government might choose to prevent some of this from happening? This shift to alternate credentials, which don't include 4 years of indoctrination?
Yeah, I mean, we saw it during COVID, right? Jenna and Shannon will have their own ideas here, but I think it's going to be like, if your neighborhood floods and nobody has flood insurance, you're just out of luck. But if the whole state floods, the government will step in and pay for everybody's repairs, right? I think if there's a nationwide disaster on the COVID scale, you're going to see the federal government bailing out the higher ed sector over and over again. But they're not going to step in every time some piddling regional, never heard of it college closes. They just can't do that.
Okay. And last but not least, we have Shannon Watkins. Want to tell us what you think is happening out there?
Yeah, so, in many ways, I feel like my topic connects to everything that we've been talking about, which is the assault against meritocracy in higher education. But first, let's review what is a meritocracy. A meritocracy exists in societies that reward, who give the rewards to those who most deserve them through hard work, ability, etc. And our universities are a main arena, and where meritocracy exists. You study hard, you get good grades, you presumably get into a good school, and the benefits go on. You're lined up with good connections and a good career. Academic accolades. A true meritocratic college admission system evaluates students, like I said, on their ability, on their intellectual accomplishments. It does not consider race, gender, gross income, athletic ability, or other non-cognitive variables. But as we've observed, many universities are moving away from a meritocratic system, especially in the admissions process. The clearest evidence of this is the abandonment of standardized tests, which are arguably the most meritocratic standard out there because of their objectivity and their proven ability to measure academic aptitude. But like I said, schools are either completely abandoning SAT or ACT or making it test optional. We'll see, if that just continues to be the trend. They say it's temporary. And they're using less objective measures, such as GPA, extracurriculars, letters of recommendations, and even students' life experiences. And also immutable characteristics such as race and gender unfortunately play a role in admissions decisions. And so there's a tangle of forces that can explain like why universities are going in this direction. But a significant one is that the allegation that merit-based criteria are inequitable for low-income and minority applicants. Some argue that SAT privileges the rich, et cetera, et cetera. There's actually lots of data out there to show that that's actually not true, that minority and low-income applicants really do rely on the objective test to demonstrate their ability, because they don't have the benefit of being able to go to a prestigious school in high school and get a GPA that really means something, or to participate in those extracurricular activities that are available in their parts of town. So even though that contention that it's unfair to minorities is not supported, schools are going down that path regardless. Undoubtedly, probably for enrollment reasons, as we were discussing earlier. And unfortunately, even medical schools, they are not necessarily admitting the best and brightest. There's allegedly not enough representation of certain groups, different demographics than low-income students. So medical schools employ racial preferences in their admissions process. And I mean, this can have catastrophic outcomes, as we all know. If someone isn't actually the best at practicing medicine, that could put someone's life in danger. The MCAT, I know, has been adjusted to include less rigorous questions so that it can close the achievement gaps among groups. And there's one test, the step one of the U.S. medical licensing exam. As of a year ago, it went from a graded scale to pass-fail, which is very scary. So here's my main takeaway is, if we continue down this path, we're looking at a future where college credentials are going to look less and less impressive. Their signaling power, as we were discussing earlier, will weaken, and it will mean less to have a degree. And it may probably will undermine the trust that the public has in licensed and credentialed professionals. People who have a degree probably in the past had some sort of indication of ability, and that's not guaranteed anymore. But I don't think the desire for higher education is just going to dry up with this trend, even though people might look for alternative ways to seek out candidates for jobs other than a college degree. I don't think that's going to completely erase the need for higher education. I think there's always going to be a segment of society who's going to desire the life of the mind and can find that in different institutions. I expect more and more alternative institutions to open up that value the academic excellence and a rich, rigorous education. And interestingly, a couple days ago, an article came out showing how enrollment in traditional, some faith-based classical schools are seeing enrollment increase. And these are colleges and universities right now. And that's very impressive against this backdrop that we have of declining enrollment in mainstream schools. And my last question, my last thought is a question though, in regards to medical schools. You know, it's easier to start up a school for philosophy, humanities pursuits, but what about the medical profession? It's not going to be easy to find different ways to train doctors well. And it's going to be hard to rescue, I think, the medical schools from the current path that they're taking. So that's just kind of a thought I want to put out there. Like, what's the answer to that current predicament?
I think I'm just going to look for doctors who are at least 45. It's going to be my type. Of course, it's going to get harder and harder as we all get older. No, but I think you're right to say that in disciplines where having an established school is really one of the only ways to go, because it's just so hard to start a new school, and where you do want formal education to be the standard, like medicine, that's a challenge, because we can't necessarily just start new things. We have to reform what is there. And I think a hard look has to be taken at medical accreditation. Obviously, accreditors are tied in with the federal government. And so it's a really big project to kind of root out the anti-meritocratic efforts across all of those sectors. But it's, it's well worth doing. And I think also there has to just be a public information campaign. People want competent doctors. I think that it's universally true. People don't necessarily care if, like their new age incense selling shop down the street is run by like a competent, crystal lady, right? Doesn't matter. But people want competent doctors. And so I think if you tell people, hey, universities are dumbing down their standards for their medical schools, they're dumbing down the MCAT, they're letting in doctors who are not qualified, and they're letting out doctors who are not qualified, that this is something where people will really care. And I think a public awareness campaign can do a lot to create movement on that front.
And that's before we even get to some of the anti-Western, quote unquote, other ways of knowing that you see Canadian universities and med schools obsessing about. It's very tempting to believe that we as a civilization just will not allow ourselves to die on this hill of med school wokeness. But
so are medical schools going to start having healing crystals too?
It wouldn't surprise me if they already do, or indigenous knowledge instead of contemporary medical methods. It's Shannon, you had sent us the James Hankins piece from First Things, The Honor Deficit, and I thought that was a fascinating article. He mentions that the U.S. Raised up what he calls an aristocracy of talent because we lacked a hereditary aristocracy. My question is, what comes after the aristocracy of talent? We seem to be building an aristocracy of oppression, which is simply another form of hereditary aristocracy. And it's not clear to me what role colleges will have in the new aristocracy of oppression's maintenance. On the other hand, I suspect that, to take Harvard as an example, I suspect that in many academic departments, a Harvard education, as distinguished from a Harvard credential, has been worthless for a generation. But as long as schools like Harvard are able to maintain their admissions selectivity, they're going to retain that cultural cachet. And so even as we as a culture abandon meritocracy, I think we're going to see, as we've talked about, the higher end schools really suffering no punishment for it.
I do wonder, though, over the long term, if that will be true, because the graduates they're going to be producing and I do hear what you said about how it's really been probably a generation of students, but can it really be possible that, after having lowering your standards for so long, that the kinds of graduates you're outputting into society is not going to have any sort of negative effect on your reputation? Well, at least in his article, Professor Hankins makes this statement, or at least this is a possibility he predicts. Elite universities will be reduced to brand names with large endowments, and their brands will gradually be cheapened. I find that plausible. Of course, we're talking about how long, but I think eventually that could be the case.
I think in so many ways, though, they're entrenched, right? The people who work at the large consulting companies, for example, the people who work on Wall Street, people in government, they've got Harvard degrees, and Harvard does legacy admissions, right? And so you perpetuate the network. And so it's really not so different than the old aristocracy, really. It's perpetuating a network of people who are, all part of the Harvard family. It's obviously not quite as closed as the network of old aristocracy, but it's got a lot in common with it. And I think that it's perpetuated, despite the content of courses. So we're all sitting here talking about the fact that, Harvard probably isn't all it's cracked up to be. It takes a lot to make it into, all of society.
Right.
Now, if society is organized along a new standard of obedience to this new political whatever Graham was talking about, Harvard will still succeed at producing the people who best adhere to the new standard. That may be what they're already doing. So if the political system stays in that frame, in the current frame where we're moving in that direction, it can perpetuate for quite some time. I'm thinking of the old Soviet system where, as long as you adhered to the party line, the colleges train people to adhere to the party line, as long as they adhered to the party line.
Right.
And so they will still have a great reputation for producing people who adhere to the standard. That's one consideration. Another thing, with the medical schools, I think what you'll start to see maybe is a lot of medical tourism that has been increasing. People will run to India or Czechoslovakia or some other countries that are making a play for doing extremely high level surgery and whatever, so that now that's mostly at the higher end. The rest of us hoi polloi will have to take what we can get. But so that's a possibility I see as well.
It's a real opportunity, though, for a medical school that already exists somewhere in the US to say, we're not doing this. We're going to be a meritocracy. And we are going to produce the best darn doctors in the US and to really set themselves apart. And I think that, there's an opportunity to do that in almost every kind of school. And I think, Shannon, you said it's happening with classical schools for undergraduate education to, the great books education, where people are really getting that, that liberal foundation that they got 100 years ago. But professional schools can do it too. But I think I think it's more likely that a current existing medical school can do it than a startup.
Okay, well, I think we've covered the world of higher ed pretty well here, and we hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please like or subscribe. And if you want to see more Martin Center content, please visit our website at www.jamesgmartin.center. Thank you very much.